One night, marked by blood on the doors, cries across Egypt, and silence among a protected people. But why would God command something so unusual? And what really happened that night that changed history forever? That night didn't begin suddenly. It was prepared over several days, with specific instructions, practical decisions, and a growing sense of anticipation in the air. While Egypt was still trying to make sense of the plagues that had shaken everything around them, inside the homes of Israel something very different was happening. A kind of quiet, almost urgent preparation, as if each family knew they were about to cross a point of no return. The biblical text makes it clear that this wasn't just about waiting for a miracle. There were clear, detailed instructions that had to be followed exactly as given. A specific animal, a precise moment, a defined way of acting inside the house. And that raises an important question. Why did God structure that deliverance in such a precise and at the same time unusual way? When you read this account carefully, you start to notice that nothing there was symbolic in an empty sense. Every action had a direct consequence. Every decision carried weight that very same night. This wasn't a religious ceremony like the ones we know today. It was a real event, lived under tension, where obeying or ignoring the instructions would make all the difference. And that's exactly what we're going to understand here. Not just what happened, but how it happened. How those families organized themselves. What the lamb really meant. Why the blood on the doors was essential. And what clearly separated those who were spared from those who faced the worst outcome. Because Passover, before becoming a celebration, was a night of decision. If you want to understand the Bible in a deeper, clearer way, without oversimplifying, make sure to subscribe and stay until the end, because the details of this story completely change how most people see this moment. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, your city or country. It's always powerful to see how far this message is reaching. Before that night ever happened, there's a context that needs to be clearly understood. Because Passover doesn't begin with freedom. It begins with prolonged oppression. The people of Israel were not in Egypt by accident, nor did they arrive there as slaves. The Bible itself shows that everything started very differently back in the days of Joseph. There was a time when the Israelites were welcomed, settled in a fertile region, living with a certain level of stability. But over generations, that reality slowly changed until it became almost unrecognizable. Exodus tells us that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that detail, which might seem small, changes everything. Because from that moment on, Israel is no longer seen as an ally, but as a potential threat. Not because of open conflict, but because of their growing numbers. And this is where an important practical detail comes in. Egypt was a highly organized and structured empire with strong social and political control. A foreign people growing within its borders, maintaining their identity, their customs, and increasing in number, that created strategic concern. Pharaoh's solution wasn't immediate destruction. It was something more calculated, control through oppression. The biblical text shows that the Israelites were subjected to forced labor. This wasn't just hard work. It was labor designed to wear them down. Building cities, producing materials, constant effort under pressure. And the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, which only increased Egypt's fear. So the situation escalates. First oppression, then harsher measures. At one point, Pharaoh orders that Hebrew male newborns be killed. This shows that the situation wasn't just economic exploitation. It was a direct attempt to weaken the future of that people. And yet, Israel continues to exist. They continue to grow. They continue to multiply. And it's in this context that something crucial appears, the cry. The Bible says the people groaned because of their bondage, and that detail matters, because this isn't just silent suffering. There comes a point where pain turns into collective outcry, a recognition that the situation cannot be solved by human strength alone. And then the text says something direct. God heard them, but hearing, in this case, doesn't mean immediate action. A process begins to unfold. God doesn't act randomly or impulsively. He initiates a structured deliverance with clear stages, defined confrontations, and a very specific purpose, not just to bring the people out of Egypt, but to establish a visible separation between Israel and that land. And here's something many people overlook. The deliverance wouldn't be simple because the problem wasn't just slavery, it was the system that sustained it. Pharaoh wasn't just a resistant ruler, he represented an entire structure of power, economy, and control. To free Israel meant confronting that system directly. And that explains why everything that follows doesn't happen instantly. The Khuruj from Egypt doesn't begin with open doors, it begins with resistance. And at the center of that resistance is Pharaoh's heart. The biblical text repeatedly says that his heart was hardened. This isn't just emotional language, it describes a posture. Even in the face of clear signs, even when confronted with events beyond explanation, the decision remained the same, not to let the people go. This creates a growing tension. Because now it's not just about a people wanting to leave, it's about a direct confrontation between God's command and Pharaoh's refusal. And that leads to the next unavoidable point in the story. If the people would not be released by Pharaoh's decision, then something would have to happen to break that resistance. Something that wouldn't be symbolic, but impossible to ignore. Something that would impact Egypt progressively until there was no other option left. And this is exactly where the story shifts. Because the deliverance truly begins when God moves from hearing to acting in a visible way. But that action would come in a way no one in Egypt could control, and one that Pharaoh, despite resisting, would be forced to face. The confrontation between God and Pharaoh doesn't begin as a single dramatic event. It unfolds as a progression, almost like a carefully structured escalation. And this matters, because the plagues of Egypt were not just displays of power. They followed a pattern, a sequence, and an increasing level of impact that touched different areas of Egyptian life. It all begins with a simple and direct request. Let my people go. Moses and Aaron don't come with an immediate threat, but with a clear command. Pharaoh's response, however, already reveals the nature of the conflict. He doesn't just refuse, he questions, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" That question sets the tone for everything that follows. Because what's at stake is not just Israel's freedom, its authority. And each plague that follows becomes a direct, practical answer to that question. The first sign, the Nile turning into blood, strikes at the very heart of Egypt. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the foundation of life, agriculture, and survival. To make its waters unusable wasn't a small disruption, it was a direct hit to the structure of the entire nation. And yet, Pharaoh's heart remains unchanged. Then the plagues continue. Frogs, gnats, flies, each one affecting a different aspect of daily life. These are not distant or symbolic events. They are real, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. Egypt begins to experience in a very practical way that something is out of control. But in the middle of this process, a detail begins to emerge that completely changes how we understand what's happening. At a certain point, the Bible shows a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The plagues affect Egypt, but not in the same way in the land where Israel lives. This is not just protection, it's visible separation. It's as if God is drawing a clear line between two groups, showing that this is not a natural disaster, but a targeted action. Even so, Pharaoh continues to resist. And here, a pattern repeats itself over and over again. Under pressure, he temporarily gives in. He agrees to let the people go, but once relief comes, he changes his mind. This makes something very clear. The issue was never lack of evidence. It was a matter of decision. Meanwhile, the intensity of the plagues increases. Disease strikes the livestock. Painful sores affect people. Hail destroys crops. Then locusts consume what remains. Step by step, Egypt's stability begins to collapse. This isn't immediate destruction, it's a gradual breakdown. And this creates an interesting effect. Even Pharaoh's own officials begin to recognize what's happening. At one point, they essentially admit that Egypt is already ruined. The awareness of the situation is no longer limited to Moses or the Israelites. It becomes undeniable to everyone. And still, the final decision remains in Pharaoh's hands. Then something different happens. After multiple plagues, after clear signs, after direct impact, God announces one more intervention. But this time, it would not be like the others. It wouldn't be a plague that causes discomfort, loss, or disruption. It would be something final, something that could not be reversed once it happened. At that point, the entire tone of the story shifts. Because for the first time, It's not only Egypt that has to respond. The people of Israel themselves receive specific instructions. Until now, they had been protected, watching what was happening. Now, they would have to act, and not just in any way, but by following precise and detailed instructions. This raises a deeper question than anything before. If God had already been demonstrating his power over Egypt, why require such a specific action from his own people? Why, at the most decisive moment, would protection not come automatically, but depend on a visible and immediate response? This is where the story reaches its most sensitive point, because what comes next is not just another sign. It is the night that will define everything. After everything that had happened up to that point, it would be reasonable to expect deliverance to come in a direct way, without intermediaries, without additional requirements. But the biblical text takes a different direction. Before the final intervention, God doesn't just announce what will happen. He gives detailed instructions to the people of Israel. And those instructions are not general. Each family is told to set apart a lamb, not just any animal, not a last-minute choice. The text is specific. A lamb without defect, selected at the right time, kept under observation for several days before it is sacrificed. This already shows that this wasn't an impulsive act. It was intentional, prepared in advance. And here is a detail many people overlook, but it carries real weight. The lamb wasn't just chosen. It became part of the household environment for those days. That means this wasn't distant or mechanical. There was proximity, presence, a direct connection. That animal was there, visible, until the exact moment it had to be sacrificed. Then comes the central instruction, the blood. It wasn't enough to sacrifice the lamb. The blood had to be collected and applied to the doorposts and the top frame of the house. In other words, a visible external mark placed exactly at the point of entry. And that raises an unavoidable question. If God already knew who his people were, why require a visible sign on the door? The text itself gives a clue when it says the blood would be a sign. Not so God could find out something, but as a mark of identification in that specific moment. Something that clearly separated those inside that covenant from those who were not. And this wasn't about internal belief alone. It was about a concrete response. And the instructions continue. The meat of the lamb could not be prepared in just any way. It wasn't to be boiled, for example. It had to be roasted over fire, whole, without breaking its bones. And more than that, it had to be eaten that same night. Nothing could be left until morning, and whatever remained had to be burned. This shows that it wasn't just symbolic. It was a meal with purpose. The people also had to be ready to leave. The instruction is clear. Eat in haste, with your clothes secured, sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. This wasn't a meal of rest. It was a meal of transition, as if that night allowed no delay, no hesitation. Everything points to urgency. And that reveals something important about how this deliverance was being carried out. God doesn't just declare what he will do. He involves the people in the process. Each family had to act, prepare, obey, and mark their own house. There was no neutrality that night. Either the instruction was followed, or it wasn't. And that brings us back to the central question, why the blood? Within the biblical context, blood is directly connected to life, not as an abstract symbol, but as a concrete representation. By applying the blood to the door, that house was, in a sense, being marked by substitution. Something had already been given there. The Bible doesn't explain every implication in detail at that moment, but the pattern is clear. The blood was not decorative. It had a direct function in what was about to happen. And there's another detail that often goes unnoticed. The mark was on the outside of the house. That means it wasn't something only visible to those inside. It was a public, external sign, placed exactly where any entry would happen. That makes the action even more significant, because it wasn't just about believing internally, it required visible obedience. Meanwhile, the rest of Egypt continued its routine, without fully understanding what was about to take place. There's no indication that the Egyptians had any equivalent preparation. The contrast begins to form right here. On one side, marked houses, prepared families, instructions followed carefully. On the other, an apparent normalcy, about to be interrupted. And then, everything converges into a single moment, that same night. No room for adjustment, no second chance, no last-minute warning. What had been prepared over days would now be tested in a matter of hours, and the difference between life and loss would not be determined by strength or status, but by the response to that specific instruction, because what was about to happen could not be avoided, only passed through. If this already made you see this story in a different way, take a moment and leave a like. And if you want to keep understanding the Bible at this level of depth, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, up to this point, what has stood out to you the most? There comes a moment when everything that was prepared stops being theory and becomes reality. And in the Passover account, that moment happens during the night. Not over several days, not gradually, but concentrated into a short, silent, and absolutely decisive window of time. After all the instructions, after the lamb had been set apart, after the doors were marked and the meal was eaten in haste, the moment arrives when there is nothing left to do. The families of Israel are inside their homes. The atmosphere is likely filled with restrained expectation. There is no sign of early celebration, no sense of complete calm. There is preparation, and now, waiting. Meanwhile, Egypt continues without that same level of awareness. Even after all the previous plagues, there's no indication that the entire population fully understood what was about to happen that specific night. And that makes the contrast even sharper. On one side, houses marked with blood, people awake, ready, alert. On the other, an apparent normal routine, about to be shattered. The biblical text is direct. At midnight, the final intervention happens. There is no gradual escalation here, no increasing intensity like the earlier plagues. This is a single, concentrated event with immediate impact across the entire land of Egypt. And that detail matters, because it shows this is not localized or limited. It reaches from Pharaoh's house to the lowest level of society. There is no distinction based on power, status, or position. The reach is total, but at the same time, there is a very specific distinction. The houses marked with blood are not touched, and this is where the meaning of Passover becomes clear. It carries the idea of passing over, not simply moving through, but passing above, not striking what has been marked. So the difference wasn't geography. It wasn't the structure of the house. It wasn't the strength of the people inside. The difference was the mark. This reinforces everything that had been building from the beginning. That night would not be defined by human effort, status, or attempts at protection. It would be defined by response to what God had commanded. Inside the homes of Israel, the scene is completely different. There is no account of loss, no chaos. What exists is preservation. And that doesn't happen randomly or because of personal merit, but because of a specific action taken hours earlier, the blood on the door. While cries begin to rise across Egypt, and the text emphasizes this, inside the marked houses there is a different reality. Not necessarily silence in emotion, but protection from what is happening outside. And that contrast can be felt. On one side, collective anguish. On the other, a night passed through under protection. This creates a contrast that cannot be ignored, because this is not just an invisible spiritual event. It is something real, audible, undeniable. All of Egypt is shaken, and this time, there is no room for negotiation. Up until that moment, Pharaoh had still tried to maintain control, shifting back and forth depending on the pressure. But now, the situation goes beyond any political or strategic response. This time, it becomes personal, and that changes everything. The text shows that in the middle of the night, Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron. There is no delay, no bargaining, no resistance at that moment. The command is now clear, direct, and urgent. The people must leave. This is important to understand. The deliverance does not happen at the moment of the promise, nor during the plagues, nor even during the instructions. It becomes real after that night, after something irreversible takes place. And that leads to another key detail. The people of Israel don't leave days later. They leave immediately, still under the weight of what has just happened. This explains why the instructions included being dressed, ready, prepared to move. It wasn't symbolic. It was practical. There would be no time to organize afterward, no time to plan once the moment arrived. Everything had to be ready beforehand, and it was. The families knew what to do. They had followed the instructions. They were prepared. That's what allows the transition from protection to movement to happen without delay. While Egypt is still processing what just happened, Israel begins to move. And there's one more element in that moment. The Egyptians themselves begin urging them to leave. There's a growing sense of urgency, as if Israel's presence has become a risk. What was once resisted is now accelerated. The deliverance finally happens, but not as a random or isolated event. It is the result of a process that began with a cry, moved through confrontation, required preparation, and was defined in a single night. A night where the difference between being struck or being preserved was not about escaping, but about having responded correctly before it happened. And that leaves a mark that cannot be forgotten. Because what happened there was not just a social or political release. It was something so precise, so structured, and so impactful that it would have to be remembered for generations. And that is exactly what begins from that moment forward. After that night, there is no more negotiation. What had once been a repeated request, "Let my people go," now becomes a command accepted under pressure. Pharaoh doesn't just allow them to leave, he urges it. The biblical text makes it clear. There is urgency. This is not a calm, organized release, nor a formal agreement. It is a rapid departure. And this explains why every previous instruction mattered so much. Because in practice, there would be no time to prepare after the decision. Everything had to be done beforehand. And it was. The people begin to move almost immediately. Entire families, organized in groups, carrying what they can. The Bible mentions that they take their dough before it is leavened. That detail is not random. It's evidence of how fast everything is happening. There is no time for normal processes. Everything moves at the pace of urgency. And this brings us to an important practical point. This is not a small group. The biblical account points to a large number of people, men, women, children, along with livestock. This means the movement itself is complex, a mass departure that could easily become chaotic. And yet, it happens, which suggests something important. The people were already aligned. The families were ready. The previous instructions weren't just spiritual, they were also preparing them for this exact moment. Another detail stands out here. The reaction of the Egyptians. The text says they give the Israelites silver, gold, and clothing. At first that might seem surprising, but in context, it makes sense. There is a clear desire for Israel to leave as quickly as possible. This is no longer about control. It's about ending the situation. It's as if Egypt finally recognizes that it cannot sustain this any longer. And so, the departure happens. Israel does not leave as a hidden group escaping in secret, but as a people being released after an event no one could stop. That completely changes how we understand the deliverance. This was not a quiet escape. It was a visible outcome of everything that had just taken place. But there is something even more important happening here. God establishes that this moment must not be forgotten. From this point forward, Passover is no longer just a single night. It becomes an established remembrance. The people are instructed to observe it every year, not as an empty tradition, but as an active memory of how the deliverance happened. And that includes details: the lamb, the unleavened bread, the urgency, the night itself. It's not just remembering that they were delivered, it's remembering how. And that answers something essential, because Passover doesn't begin as a celebration in the usual sense. It begins as a marker, a dividing line. Before, slavery. After, the path toward freedom. And that transition was not abstract. It happened through stages, actions, decisions, and one defining night. Over time, that memory remains. Generations that never lived that moment begin to observe it, not as something distant, but as part of their identity. Passover becomes more than a historical event. It becomes a reference point. Every time it is remembered, it points back to that night. But it also reinforces something in the present, that God did not just hear, He acted, intervened, and made a way. And this is where the story reaches an even deeper level. Because when you look at all these elements, the lamb, the blood, the preservation, the deliverance, a question naturally arises. Was all of this only about that moment in Egypt? Or does it point to something greater, something beyond that generation? The structure itself suggests there is more here than just a historical event. There is a pattern, there is a logic, And there is a meaning that continues to be remembered, studied, and reflected on to this day. Because Passover did not end that night. It began there. Passover did not begin as a celebration. It began as a response. A response to a cry that had been rising for generations under oppression. A response to a promise that had not been forgotten. And above all, a response from a people who had to act at the right moment, following instructions that did not always seem logical at first. When you look at the full sequence, from slavery to confrontation to the plagues and finally to that night, it becomes clear that nothing happened randomly. There is structure, there is intention. Everything builds toward a decisive moment. And that moment was not just about God acting. It was about how people responded to what he said. The blood on the door was not an empty symbol. It was a visible act of obedience. The lamb was not just ritual. It was part of a process that involved choice, preparation, and action. The urgency, the readiness, and the details, all of it shows that this was not an ordinary night. It was a turning point, and that answers the title directly. Passover was born in that moment, in a real context, under pressure, through practical decisions with immediate consequences. It didn't begin as a religious tradition or a planned celebration. It began at the limit, at the point where there was no more room for negotiation, where the difference between staying and leaving was defined by a clear response. And over time, that moment was not forgotten. It became living memory. God commands it to be remembered every year, not just to look back, but to preserve the understanding of how that deliverance happened. Because it wasn't just about leaving Egypt. It was about how that exit became possible. And that's where the story stops being just history and starts becoming something deeper. Because the pattern is still clear. There is a problem, there is an intervention, and there is a required response. Passover shows that it was not human strength that brought freedom, nor a political shift in Egypt. It was a direct act of God, met with a specific practical obedience at the right time. And that leads to an unavoidable reflection. How many people know the story, but have never paid attention to the details that actually matter? How many see Passover as a date, but not as a process? Because once you understand how it really happened, the story is no longer distant. It gains structure, meaning, weight. That night was not just about judgment or deliverance. It was about a mark, a decision, and about being, or not being, within what God had established. And maybe that's why this story continues to be told, not just as memory, but as an invitation to understand. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, had you ever understood Passover in this way, with all these details? Because as we've seen from the beginning, what seems like a moment from the past still carries a meaning that reaches far beyond that night.